Okay, people, it's late in the day on a Sunday night, but I feel kind of compelled, even though I'm a little tired, here to expand the conversation because it's been on my mind all day. So hopefully I am um, lucid enough to deal with the material. Um, well, I mean, in a lot of ways, what I'm going to try to offer is not so much lucidity, but my personal perspective here. Um, there are others out there, like I say, Ken Wilber or such, who do lucid very well. Um, I'm more inclined to talk about the lived experience and the personal. That's been more my path. I have a tendency to believe that it's probably the more important path, but it will always be the marginal path. I understand that. Um, anyway, we'll give it a try. I mean, there's a quote here that's relevant from Henry David Thoreau, like, and I'm going to paraphrase because I'm doing this from memory. Like, you have a choice to either be a philosopher, meaning a professional individual who practices the love of wisdom in their own life, or someone who teaches that stuff, who is an authority on the various and historical means by which individuals did that, right? And they're very different paths. They're very different choices. Like, there was certainly a part of me that wanted to be a professor of philosophy. I didn't get those opportunities, and I ended up having to live life as a philosopher, which is perhaps less glamorous, but perhaps more lucrative and more interesting. Um, Lived philosophy as opposed to professed philosophy is a radically different thing that's important to the conversation as we get into it. Of the branches of philosophy that I found most pertinent to my own experience as I went through it was certainly epistemology, or the science of understanding states of knowledge, which still remains, especially even now, especially as we are trying to create artificial minds, one of the most relevant branches of philosophy and one of the thorniest. Anyone who wants to be a practical philosopher needs to create an abstraction or a model by which they navigate that, and it's really hard. The way that I personally went about it as a young man, and it's stuck by me, is to see that there is a spectrum of confidence that exists within the mind between things that you know are true and things that you wish might be true or you suspect. And of course, faith is outside that at the bottom end. That becomes important. Um, why does it become important? Well, because there's a role of evidence to play. Evidence doesn't have any role to play in faith. Evidence does have a role to play in knowledge. Like, if there's something that you just suspect and you're given evidence for it or against it, it changes where your perspective is on the spectrum of knowledge. Once you get to the point where you say that you really, really know something, you're in a situation where it would take a lot of evidence to change your opinion, like a ton. In fact, you're highly, highly confident. In fact, what knowledge really comes down to in a lot of ways is just a state of confidence that you have seen so much evidence for a thing that you need even greater evidence to upset the evidence that you've already seen to make a change of mind. That's a practical definition. It's kind of mine. But there is an interesting aspect to it that we should also discuss. And that's this, that there is a lot of material out there that passes as knowledge, which is really just complete sophist abstraction that has no bearing whatsoever on your real life and your real world, right? And there's a whole entire profession of gassing off about crap that makes no difference whatsoever to your entire life. Some of that gets claimed as knowledge. I don't want to get into the finer minutiae of how to epistemologically dissect that, but allow me to offer something else. If the knowledge that you have is real and practical and non-abstract enough, it will always be actionable, meaning that there will be things that you will and can understand and that you have sufficient evidence for, and the knowledge of these things will change your behavior. There's another entire class of crap that in a lot of ways resembles faith, which doesn't change your behavior either, typically meaningfully. I'm not even sure what to call it. Somebody out there who's more professional than I can. Things that you can abstract about, but are so obtuse and so intellectual that they have no bearing on anything meaningful. I would rather personally exclude that set of conceptions, even though that it might be valuable, from the terminology of what we call knowledge. For me, as I would like to think about it, knowledge should be the set of things that can be known and enforced by evidence and create states of awareness, predictability, strategies, and the rest that are actually actionable. And the confidence that you get from knowledge encourages action. I'm very suspect of anyone who claims to know a thing but doesn't have or exhibit behavior that would be congruous with that knowledge. I have a tendency to think that that's very suspect. Now, of course, any of you that have a background from esoteric tradition would know where I'm leading with this. I mean, surprisingly, a lot of esoteric tradition is very, very, very practical and actionable if applied correctly. We live at this funny moment of crisis where very often we are hearing again and again, because of the conflict of perhaps modern or postmodern philosophy or whatever we pretend it to be out there, a conflict of ways of seeing the world, a lot of false dichotomies presented between right and left, or male or female, or black or white, or rich versus poor, like 10,000 things. And of course, there's tremendous validity to all of those conflicts. Like, I'm not in any way at all ever going to deny the fact that there isn't real, legitimate, earned, lived experience friction in any of those dynamics. Like, that's all completely true. But that is not the existential threat of our era. It's not, unfortunately. And that makes me sad. That gives me great grief, because I'd love to see the historic harms of all of those issues resolved. But they're not going to be resolved, because we are faced with this. The false dichotomy and the legacy of our culture. The false dichotomy of man versus nature. Wrap your head around that. We are killing the natural world to support our habits. If we do not resolve that, left versus right, male versus female, black versus white, rich versus poor, it's a moot point. We will all be dead people on a dead planet. Wrap your head around that. If you're going to integrate anything, it is essential to integrate this. Man has to navigate the integration process to be a participant, not a combatant with the natural world. If we do not achieve this, it is all over and within our lifetime. See, contrary to what is commonly held, although this is part of this path that we're describing, the task for us now, individually and as a species, is not one of development to a state of self-actualization, although that is a necessary part of this process. What we have to do to survive is to transcend the self, meaning that we need to come to a state of actionable knowledge, actionable knowledge, where we understand viscerally that we are extensions of the whole of the life process, and our fundamental alliances need to be just as much there as they are here within. There isn't a false dichotomy of the natural world and ourselves. That's an illusion. That's an illusion that comes from hostility towards nature that we inherit from our conservative past. No, we have to understand for real, actionably, demonstrably, confidently, that if we are going to actually survive personally, transcending our myopic, self-centered, egotistical aims and goals, transcending all that is absolutely essential so that we can participate in the life process itself without participating in the life process as a co-creator. The demands and strains that we put on the systemic whole to support our weak egos, well, it's simply too large for the system to bear unless we are able to engage with that in a reciprocal manner. The system is going to collapse under its own weight. So I really do see this as the fundamental task of our era. It is the perhaps final trial for mankind. If we are able to transcend the petty needs of the ego and the individual in a joyous, creative manner. I mean, we're not talking about denying the self. We're not talking about denying self-actualization. We're talking about getting into a position of personal empowerment and authentic living that is robust enough that simply the self becomes unimportant anymore. And that one is unfettered from those petty primal needs in such an abundant manner that participating in life, as I like to say, as a co-creative participant is the natural next step. We have to drive this way, all of us, individually and collectively. Every other issue, every other social problem, every other injustice in the world, while they are all radically important too, the success of meeting those challenges is completely contingent on being alive to be able to do so. We have put off the most important integration process so long now that the situation is truly desperate, not only are we unlikely to solve these historic injustices, valid though they truly are, we're unlikely to survive. Our efforts should be unified towards that end. We, at this late stage, everything else rightly should be seen as a distraction. Cheers, peeps.